People do want to see a fight. I, too, am concerned about the direction of where this country is headed. But if we stick together and we work together, I think we'll find our way through.
This is What It Takes from Unmoderated News. I'm Sarah McCammon. Illinois Congresswoman Nikki Budzinski is the kind of Democrat a lot of people say the party needs more of. She spent a decade in the labor movement. She likes to say she's one of few members of Congress who's been on the kill floor of a meatpacking plant. Now, Congresswoman Budzinski represents a sprawling district in central and southern Illinois that includes steel mills, soybean fields, and a college town. She's trying to answer a question her party can't afford to get wrong. How do Democrats win back working people who've stopped believing the party is fighting for them? We talked in her office on Capitol Hill. Congresswoman Nikki Budzinski, thanks so much for having us here in your office on the Hill.
Great to be with you, Sarah.
It's a busy day on Capitol Hill. There's some noise, so we might hear that in the background today as we talk.
Yep.
We're both Midwesterners.
Yep.
You grew up in Peoria, Illinois, which is kind of this like quintessential American city. There's this old saying, how does it play in Peoria?
Mm-hmm.
Which kind of gets at this idea that, how is something going to go over with normal, ordinary Americans?
Right.
And then you spent some time moving around before you came back to Illinois. How did that experience as a young child growing up, living in all those places, how did that shape the way you think about yourself and about politics?
Well, I remember every summer my sister and I would spend time with them, and they so my one set of grandparents, they live in a very small town called Dixon, Illinois. It's the hometown of Ronald Reagan. My grandfather, because both of them were teachers, again, they had a pension. They lived a middle-class life. He had a boat. I learned to water ski, and I only point that out because I think things like boats and vacations and things like that, I think are, I think just increasingly more challenging for people to actually own. But family was really important. I think also just, kindness. I think showing up. They also were very active in their community as well, whether it was like Rotary or the Garden Club. So teaching me at an early age the importance of community and being involved, I thought was important. That's really hard as a kid, when you move around. We moved around to a number of different places, and it does, I think, in some ways, you look back on your life and you can kind of connect the dots with, oh, maybe those were life skills that actually now in this job are really helpful to have. But when you're 7 or 8 years old, it's incredibly awkward to be at a new school. But I think it just gives you exposure to different environments, different people. One of the things I think that can be the hardest for anyone is change, just change in general. And I think when you learn that skill at a young age, change then when you're older is less scary. So in some ways, when I look back on all the moves we had and, I think just the different opportunities and different settings I grew up in, it actually is really an asset now in helping to form kind of the way I look at new things that come my way.
You have devoted your career really to working for working people, working in the labor movement and in other roles in politics before you were elected to Congress yourself.
Yeah.
But you've never punched a clock, right? So how do you sort of bridge that gap between the workers' experience and your own?
Yeah, I would say that the time I worked in the labor movement for 10 years. I actually started, my first job was at the Laborers International Union. I worked for the International Association of Firefighters, but I served as the national political director for 7 years of the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. Who they are meatpackers and retail workers. So when I ended up running for office, I often tell my constituents or remind them that I'm an elected official that has been on a kill floor. I think it's really important in order to really connect with working people in this country is to show up, not just show up in their communities, but oftentimes it is on the job site or the work site and seeing the work that they're doing, the challenges, the opportunities that those jobs present. And I can't think of a more clearer example of that than when I was in Butchertown, Kentucky, visiting a unionized meat processing facility, being on the kill floor, seeing that dangerous job that is done done, now actually mostly by a lot of immigrant women, and it's a very challenging environment, and to see that that's what workers are kind of faced with. I also saw because of for them, their union contract was what helped ensure they got a good wage, good benefits, they had a safe working condition in a pretty dangerous work environment. And so I just think it's really important, and that's what really grounds me is not just the fact that I say I'm a dues paying union member, that I worked in the labor movement, but that I've actually shown up and worked, side by side, seen the dangerous work that workers are doing and kind of how we can support them through public policy.
How does the work that you do when you walk into this office look different because you've spent that time, listening to workers, traveling the country,
Yeah.
seeing some of those places?
Sometimes the thing I would be critical of in Washington is we can get in this bubble. We talk about the Washington, D.C. bubble where we're so busy with our day to day policy briefings and reading the next, legislative bill text, et cetera. But when you get into the real world and you're meeting with families that are literally making very difficult decisions, folks that are working every day, drive a used car, aspiring to own a home, maybe they just rent. What are they going to do to help provide maybe some assistance for their children to go to a place of higher education? How do they put food on their table? I think those are the real issues that I refer to them as the issues that wake you up at night, that I certainly have met with and visited and know constituents that struggle with that every day. And I try to bring those issues to the center focus of what I do every day.
Now, before you came to Congress, one of the jobs you had was working for Governor J.B. Pritzker in Illinois. And one of the big fights was over the minimum wage. You
Right.
successfully helped get through a $15 minimum wage in Illinois, but it took a lot of time. There were a lot of stakeholders. There were some trade-offs, as I understand it.
Very much.
How did you get that done?
We all worked together. But one of the things that was very formative as an experience for me in learning about the art of negotiation and legislating, we had business at the table. At the same table, we had labor. We had folks on all sides of this issue. Passing a $15 minimum wage in the state was a commitment that Governor Pritzker had made when he was running for office. This was very unusual for us in Illinois. Our legislative calendar usually puts off these really big, kind of more quote unquote controversial issues until later into the spring, late May. But we had made this decision that we really wanted to try to push to do this big, that it could help to set the tone for the rest of the legislative calendar. So we actually negotiated this in January. That in and of itself was culturally very different for Springfield. But we had everyone at the table, and I would say it's the first time for me that I was on the other side of the table from labor. Labor would have liked a $15 minimum wage the next day, but we knew that the impacts were going to be felt by small businesses. Some of our social service agencies as well were going to have to increase their wage, and a lot of that social safety net in our state, whether the nonprofits, they're working within the margins, so an increase in their labor costs could have been really hard. So we wanted to negotiate over a ramp. We ended up not passing it to say it's going to go into effect the next day, but actually a 6-year ramp.
When you say a ramp, sort of a slow build.
Gradual buildup. Yes, thank you. So every year, practically a dollar increase for the next 6 years, which would then put us just until this last year, it got us to 15. But it gave time for the business community, the small business community in particular, to acclimate to this, to build this into their budgets. We also included a tax credit as well for small businesses to help relieve some of those pain points. But we didn't get everybody on board. We were really proud we were able to get the Illinois Restaurant Association. So some in business was on board. Most of all of labor was on board. We couldn't get the retail merchants, and they did try different, regional efforts around maybe a different minimum wage downstate versus Chicago. We were able to beat that back with education. But more of my point is that the whole process showed that we needed to negotiate. We needed to listen to each other, even when we didn't agree. And some of us were able to go along. Some ended up opposing, but we still were able to get it done. And I just think sometimes when people leave the negotiation table and no one is exactly thrilled, that might be, in fact, actually a good negotiation process. So we compromised, we got it done. In early February, the governor signed it into law.
And, not everybody who's working in Congress has that perspective of having been on the staffer side, or literally sitting on both sides of the negotiating table with these different groups. How does that background, that experience, shape the way that you legislate here?
What I really hope is that all of the staff experience that I've had, whether it was serving in the Office of Management and Budget or working for our governor, that it'll make me a more effective legislator for my constituents back home. And so I'm someone that would honestly tell you I never thought I would run for office myself per se. I loved public service from a staff perspective. But I got this feeling in 2022 that I wanted to do something different and I wanted to step forward in a different way. But I used all of that experience basically at the state level, at the federal level, and then working with, I mentioned the labor movement, working with outside organizations that are often knocking on our doors here on Capitol Hill. I've been that person knocking on the door of an elected official to argue or make the case for legislative change. And so all of those experience, I hope, my hope is that it makes me a more effective legislator in the end.
Was that intimidating to make that leap? I mean, I think a lot of people who are used to being behind the scenes kind of like being behind the scenes, and it's a different mode than being the person who's front and center in front of the camera. How did that feel?
Yeah, I appreciate the question because I will say, as staff, you're always taught not to talk to the press, that it's only the elected. So doing podcasts like this is something certainly that I didn't do as a staff member. So this is a different role. And it does take, I think, a certain amount of courage to decide to put your name on the ballot. I often talk a lot about at home that I think more women need to make that decision. Sometimes I think for women in particular, that's a much more challenging decision to make. When you look at Congress, there's only 128 of us that are women serving in the House of Representatives out of a 435 person body. We need more women to step forward to make that decision. But I'm not honestly someone that had been scheming since kindergarten to get into this job. I just really let public service take me where it was going to go. And yeah, I've had to make those adjustments and learn, but it's been an honor. I've really enjoyed it.
I also want to talk about sort of what you're learning about how Democrats win or don't win.
Yeah.
As you know, President Trump has won over a large part of the very movement that you've spent your career working toward. Democrats used to be the party of the working class. Now they're the party of, the college educated.
Right.
You've called your own party elitist and out of touch. Those are pretty strong words.
Yeah, they are. But I think that in a lot of communities, for a lot of working people, I think they feel like Democrats have left them behind, that Democrats have lost our core focus around helping working people with their daily lives, focusing on the issues that matter most around job security, how people are paying for gas, utility bills. I personally think that because of that disconnect with working people, I think working people in 2024 took a big gamble that unfortunately is very much not paying off for them when they might have switched over and voted for President Trump, thinking that he was actually going to be the person to provide real relief and reduce costs. Obviously, that has not panned itself out. But I think they were voting for change. I think they were voting for something different. And we need to rebuild our credibility, I think, with working people, that our singular focus is on them, on helping them in their everyday lives, getting ahead, helping them to build a better future, and rebuild and protect a middle class that for so many people either feels out of reach or is totally gone.
Democrats have started reckoning with this. There's a lot of conversation about this specific challenge. You're a leader of the New Democrat Coalition, which describes itself as a group of pragmatic Democrats.
Yeah.
And one of the things you've said is that Democrats need to listen to everybody, and especially working people. To that end, I know you've spent some time doing that. What are you hearing from people?
Yeah, I'm really excited to be a member of the New Dem coalition because I think we are thoughtful, pragmatic leaders that just want to deliver, get real things done. We're willing to work with our Republican colleagues where it makes sense. If it's going to pull something across the finish line that's going to help people in their everyday lives. But when we were talking about the bubble that we can get in Washington, one of the things the New Dems did that was different this year was we took it on the road. We actually did about 11 to 12 different, we call them on the road sessions, where we brought together stakeholders on different issues. I hosted one myself on permitting reform, how we're generating more energy, how we need to help the federal government get out of the way of some of these projects so that we can really generate more energy in this country and reduce utility bills for people. I really think that's critically important as we're talking about rebuilding that trust with some of the communities that often feel left behind and working people is showing up and listening and hearing directly from them.
One of the things that your district has been through recently, as have so many places in this country, are the impact of the ICE raids, the immigration
Yeah.
raids.
Yeah.
Several workers in a small town in your
Yeah.
district were arrested earlier this year.
Yeah.
You voted against additional funding for ICE. This is a tough issue. This is an issue where voters have said they were not happy with the Biden administration. They wanted more border security.
Yep.
But I think people also want respect for human rights and the rule of law.
That's right.
How do you talk to your constituents about this issue?
Yeah, that's a really great question because I would share with you, I too was very critical of the way the Biden administration handled the border and consistently voted to provide more financial support to the border under the Biden administration. I think he should have done something differently. I think he was late in responding. I think in September was when he really kind of addressed some of the real security issues that were happening there, which was a little too late, to be honest with you, before that November election. But then juxtapose maybe that's one side. You go all the way to where the Trump administration and how they have just dehumanized people, broken apart communities, incarcerated in some sense, United States citizens. I don't think that the American people are also supportive of that either. While they, as you said, and I agree, were critical of the way the Biden administration handled it, it's very clear that what Trump is doing is also deeply unpopular. We need to get back to the common sense issues around, yes, we need border security. We do need immigration enforcement in this country, but I think deep and meaningful reform of ICE and CBP is required in order to build back public trust for those two agencies. Unfortunately, and it's been very frustrating in a very hyper partisan environment right now where Republicans don't really, I know they say they've tried to talk to Democrats, but I think Democrats are really just asking for some common sense reform measures, the same things that we ask for from our local law enforcement, which is don't wear a mask. Why can't we see who a citizen or someone might be encountering? Identify yourself on your badge, wear a body camera. These are the types of things that aren't just good for people in the community, but also, I think, helpful to the officer as well. And so those kind of common sense reforms, I think, are needed in order to build back trust. But do we need enforcement, immigration enforcement in this country of some kind? Yes, of course we do. But I think, again, this is a great example of loud voices on kind of both sides getting the most attention. Where we need to do is get back to the middle to find these common sense solutions that also get us back to a pathway to legal status for people. We don't have enough immigration judges in this country. It should not take 20 years for someone that wants to legally come into the country and contribute to our communities to be able to legally do so. So I think we have a lot of work ahead of us on this. And what's really heartbreaking is that people in our communities are just, especially in our immigrant communities, are living in just fear. And I hear about that at home. I give you an example. Just this last weekend in the city of Urbana, there were just rumors of ICE coming to the community, and it put everyone up in, arms. People were very concerned, fearful. There were all kinds of misinformation that was spreading, and it was just creating more and more fear in the community. But we did have to take it very seriously because if ICE does show up, we want to be prepared. But I think it just speaks to, luckily, that ended up just being rumor, but I think it speaks to the high level of anxiety there is in our immigration communities because of the way this administration is handling.
Are you also hearing, though, from people who are concerned about what's happened at the border in the past? What do you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, what I say to them is we need border investment. We need a strong border. We also need to, I think, fix our asylum system in this country. One of the things that I think President Biden could have addressed, and this administration is taking a completely extreme position on basically shutting down our asylum system completely. There are asylees that are looking for refuge from very politically dangerous environments in their home countries. That's what the asylum system was built for. But what was starting to happen, I think, under the Biden administration is that folks were looking for economic asylum. And there's a distinction. And I think that if we could fix our asylum system, again, fixing the overall broken immigration system we have while securing our border, but also having immigration enforcement, I think it will create more of a law and order type of environment around immigration that will allow for a legal pathway for folks to get through.
Where people feel like they know there's a system that they can count on.
Yeah, exactly.
At the same time that Democrats like you are trying to speak to the middle, win back the working class, there are some real fractures in the Democratic Party. I think the last couple of years, the campus protests, among other things, have sort of spotlighted that. You won your primary this year by a 3-1 margin
Yeah.
against a challenger who was associated with the DSA, the Democratic
Right.
Socialists of America.
Right.
What does that say to you about what Democratic primary voters really want from candidates versus maybe what we might hear online sometimes?
Yeah. I think that what people want back home is a workhorse and not a show horse. I think ultimately, while social media is one metric that you do need to pay attention to, oftentimes it's not fully representative of the entire district. And I think mine in particular is one where I would say we've showed up consistently in communities and in communities where, and had hard discussions where maybe I might not agree necessarily with everyone. And you're, by the way, no one's going to agree with everybody all the time. And that's okay to disagree. But I think showing up, and we've done that very consistently. I think that really matters. And in the places where it's not comfortable, I think it's also important to show that you're serious about delivering. I'm not into looking for clicks and viral moments. And maybe that in some ways in this moment in our politics can be to my own detriment. But I really believe at the end of the day, and why we ended up winning by almost 76% in that primary, is I think my constituents saw that I am working every day to try to move the ball forward. I am standing up to this administration, but I have a record of real results of trying to bring things back home that matter. And I think that's what was acknowledged, or that's how I saw our end result on our primary, was that voters overwhelmingly saw that.
You said you're a workhorse, not a show horse.
Yeah.
But there are, especially Democrats, that really want to see a fight. They're
Yeah.
angry
Oh,
about
yeah.
what's happening. How do you figure out when there's actually a fight that you can win versus sort of a performative fight?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. People do want to see a fight. I think it is speaking out, and I've always spoke out, and I show up to protests. I think that's really important so that people feel seen. I think right now there's so much anxiety and fear right now that the most important thing I think you can do to demonstrate a fight is, again, showing up, speaking out where you can, and being consistent in doing that and letting folks know, I feel your anxiety. I too am concerned about the direction of where this country is headed. But if we stick together and we work together, we speak out when we object, but we work together on the places where we can find some wins, even in a difficult environment, I think we'll find our way through. I think even with the fight too, I often say at home that I believe hope is the most powerful form of resistance, because I think when it's really easy to focus on the negative, because there is so much coming at us every single day, not just as an elected, but in our communities, I think it's still important to focus on the fact that we're going to get through this. I believe that, and that we have to keep the hope and the faith that we can still lead our country to a brighter future.
You talked about working together, and you've worked across the aisle on issues like fighting corruption. You
Yes.
sponsored some bipartisan legislation meant to crack down on polymarket betting, in particular by public officials.
Yep.
What kind of damage is that kind of behavior doing to our country right now? And how can Democrats rebuild the trust in government?
It is such a good question, because I do think one of the big fundamental problems we have right now is this erosion of public trust. Not just that's not a Democrat problem, that's a government at large problem, regardless of party. The PREDICT Act that I did with Congressman Adrian Smith from Nebraska, I hope is one kind of lever to get to that, which is to say that we're seeing the explosion of the influence of these prediction markets and people taking advantage of them. The bill that Adrian and I have is actually just very narrowly focused on what I would consider the corruption element of it, or the issues around public trust. Information I might have or he might have as elected officials should never be monetized to our own financial benefit. And that's what the prediction markets, because of the anonymous, a lot of the anonymity of the bettors online, they could be public officials taking advantage of confidential information that they should not be doing. And so this bill just says that's illegal and you can't be doing that. I will say, when I talk to constituents about this bill at home, they're shocked that this isn't already illegal. But the PREDICT Act is just one example. I mean, I think we do have a fundamental problem in this country with money and politics. It is flooding. It is flooding the zone, whether it is, direct contributions or dark money, or, Citizens United has unleashed so much more money into the system that I think we need to figure out ways to get it out. It's why I actually, in my primary, one of the things we rolled out was an anti-corruption agenda, which included the PREDICT Act, but also included things like banning stock trading for members. That's something that I hope is going to continue to get increased attention, and maybe something in the Democratic majority we could get done. But all of those things, dealing with anti-corruption, money in politics, our role as elected officials in all of that, and calling it out, I think is really important to rebuilding public trust.
You're right. There's only so much that Democrats can do without being in power.
Right.
If Democrats win the House in November, it's probably going to be because a bunch of moderate Democrats flip seats. I mean, there's no other path there.
Agreed.
But we are living in a moment, I think it's very fair to say, where political extremes are front and center, where they get the attention online, where they sort of suck up all the oxygen. How do you and your colleagues think about getting things done in that environment? And how will you think about leading if you do take control of the House later this year?
Well, I think we need to, first of all, let me say, I think when we take the House back, I think, yes, there's going to be a lot of attention around accountability for this administration. Of course, we need to do that. But I think most importantly as well, equally importantly, is that we have a vision for what we're going to do for the American people as Democrats in the majority in the House. And for me, that is going back to those 5 key costs that have been increasing since the Trump administration took office. Our plans to reduce the cost of prescription drugs, to make sure that we're stabilizing the ACA, that we're rolling back these Medicaid cuts that in a district like mine that has a lot of rural health care is going to be devastating. I think there are a number of issues that we can outline for working people that should be our focus, that should be the vision that we clearly come out. And we've already started to do that, but I think really crystallizing that and being ready to go in January is just critically important. I think the other part of it is, yes, it is about I think it's gonna be interesting to see what is the art of the possible, right? That's all politics is. So we as the New Dems have always been very open to being bipartisan. We'll see what happens if Republicans are willing to work with us, but I don't ever close the door to that. I do think that if we are in the majority, it is incumbent on us to lead. Something that has been so frustrating about this Congress is the failure of Republican leadership to carry the ball across the finish line on some. We're seeing this actually literally today, whether it's related to the Farm Bill, whether it's related to just generally our federal budget. We had been kicking the can down the road with a number of continuing resolutions. These are very basic functions of government that we should be able to do. And so I think House Democrats are going to be needing to be able to lead with a vision, and prove that we're willing to work with folks on either side of the aisle to get things done for our constituents. And I think if we can do that, it's a sustained majority that we'll have.
There are some in the Democratic Party who would like to see another push toward impeachment of President Trump. Is that a good use of time?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's really important that when we come into the majority, we need to hold this administration accountable, right? I was one of the first Democrats to call on for the impeachment of Kristi Noem. Luckily, that issue resolved itself before any of those proceedings. I think we do need to strategically consider, though, it requires a two-thirds vote out of the Senate. No president has ever really been successfully removed from office. It takes a lot of political capital and a lot of time in order to do it. I wouldn't rule it out, though, because I think that there are some very egregious things that this administration has done, and accountability is something that people are going to want to see. That being said, I think we can't allow that issue in particular to suck all of the oxygen out of the room. We need to drive home the issues that matter most to people, which is bringing down costs.
How much potential do you see for potentially working with Republicans on some of those goals?
Well, I have really tried to be a pretty bipartisan member since I've come in, and I think a lot of the new Democratic members would say the same thing. Introduced many of the pieces of legislation I've introduced with a Republican colleague. I think we should do our best to see if we can work together, but I think we shouldn't let that process also hold us back from progress and working together within a caucus to bring home real wins. So I wouldn't, again, I've always said I'll work with anyone that's going to help my communities, and I think that still stands true. But I think that we need to, as Democrats, have a vision that we're driving ourselves.
Before I let you go, I want to go back to your Illinois roots,
Yeah.
back to your family's roots in labor. Your grandfather, who you've talked about, a union painter,
Yes.
and your grandmother, a teacher.
Yes.
What do you think they would think about today's Democratic Party, and what would they want to hear?
I think about my grandpa a lot, who was a union painter he passed away at 69. He retired, though, at 60. So the last 9 years of his life, because he had a union pension, he was able to enjoy with my grandmother, and my sister and I were very active parts of their life. They also owned a very small, modest two-bedroom, one-bathroom home. They had an Oldsmobile that they had paid for, that he took his pride in making sure was pristinely clean. Um, and they didn't have a credit card. They basically took money out every week. That was the cash they had to live on. They lived very modestly. But I think they would tell you that for them, that was very much the American dream. They owned a home, they owned a car, they were able to retire. And I think if they were to look at today's working families and those struggling to get into the middle class, I think that's really hard to attain today. The first time home ownership age is now at an all-time high in this country, which is 40 years old. When you think about how are people able to juggle costs of college or community colleges, debt, owning a home, buying a car.
It
I
used
talk
to be people were buying a house so they could start a family, but 40 years old,
Yes.
I mean,
And you even hear now people talking about, can they afford children? I mean, that's the kind of, I think, how expensive everything has is, and I think when you think of the American dream, it is owning a car, it is raising a family, it is owning it is being able to go on vacation. With the ACA tax credits expiring, I've talked to a number of constituents where vacations are now just completely gone. In order to remain on a health insurance plan, those kind of opportunities as a family are out of their reach. So I think about my grandparents really having lived a more classically American middle class life, and I think they'd be shocked to see the challenges that families face today.
Congresswoman Budzinski, thank you so much for your
Thank
time.
you so much. I really appreciate it.